between now and Easter. Frankly, these have always been troubling for me. They've been hard to understand. If we think about the first one, which is, first of all, I was going to say, Ken mentioned the fact that there's some talk about whether or not this is historic or exactly when it was. There's also some controversy over if it's the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. I think in Luke it's called the Sermon on the Plain. And this is how oftentimes you get involved in these little biblical kind of splitting hairs. And I got to think, well, if Jesus is giving it and he's standing on a mount, then from Jesus' perspective, it's a Sermon on the Mount. If you're down on the plain listening to Jesus, then for you, it's a Sermon on the Plain. So it can be 2 in 1, both the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, because the Bible has both the texts about the same. Let's take a look at this first one first. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom in heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom in heaven. What in the heck could that possibly mean? How could someone that's poor in spirit be blessed, number one, and how could theirs be the kingdom of heaven? It's important for us as people that live in the 21st century to understand how they understood these words and what the meanings were to these things. And when we look at this, blessed are the poor in spirit, I think what Jesus is talking to us about is, if you take a look at the disciples, they're kind of a microcosm of all the people that were in his world then. You had the zealots, you had people who were rich, you had people like John who were from very affluent families, you had guys like Peter who's like a man's man construction worker, and a whole cross-section of different type of people, indicating to us that not one segment of life is more righteous than the other. We have that access to all of us. But I think what the point is that the kingdom of heaven is not given on the basis of race, earned merits, which is what their tradition had been, by earning merits, by living up to all the expectations of the law. That the kingdom of heaven is available to those who realize that they can't live and succeed in fulfilling every piece of the law. It's only those who realize that they are spiritually bankrupt, or that we are spiritually bankrupt, and when we come before God and confess our utter dependence upon God for salvation, as opposed to anything that we can do ourselves, do we internalize the fact that we are poor in spirit. So those of us who are blessed, those of us who gain access to Christ, can only get that access at a point where we can say, there's no hope for us without Christ. There's no hope for our salvation without Christ. We can't do it on our own. For them, that may seem like second nature. We're kind of Christian people. We kind of are raised in that kind of culture. But for those people at that time, this was radical theology. And in fact, it was sort of heretical. Because those who were blessed before Jesus said these words were the ones who lived by every jot and tittle of the law. Those who lived a perfect life. And it was their ambition, the Pharisees of the time, it was their ambition to have everybody in the Jewish nation live a perfect life. If everybody could live by all the rules exactly, the kingdom would come. That's what their goals were. Jesus came to say, it's not going to work. God has a different plan. And his plan is for you to admit you can't live by the law. That the only way for you to live in any kind of relationship with God is to understand your own brokenness, to understand the fact that you cannot get to this point on your own through your works. So this first beatitude is a lesson in having an attitude of we can't do it on our own. And what a challenge we have here where we live, that these hills are full of people that have done it on their own. They have their beautiful houses, they have their good interest rates maybe, they have their nice cars, they have kids in private schools, or they're going to whatever colleges or something like that. They have done it on their own. So what do they need the church for? It's to a large extent of us reaching out to those people, because they may have done it on their own, but inside of all of us there is a hole that can only be filled by God's Spirit. And that's why we're in ministry here in the hills, to minister to everybody in the area that has yet to see that, has yet to understand the fact that all those great works that they do everything that they try to do to fulfillment are lacking. And it's only by these words of Christ where we acknowledge the fact that we are poor in spirit, there will be our blessing. We can have access to Christ. We will be blessed. Not in heaven necessarily, although we will be, but not in some afterlife, because the tense here is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Not the fact that theirs will be the kingdom of heaven. So we have immediate access to relationship with Christ, immediate access to an aspect of the kingdom immediately today, based upon acknowledging that of being poor in spirit. Now let's take a look at the second one. Blessed are those who mourn. Now how can that work? How can it work that those who mourn, which I would think of as being sad, can be comforted? If you're mourning, it's impossible to be comforted unless it's by something maybe outside of yourself. And I think that's what Christ is getting at. When I think of mourning, I think of my cat that died or something like that. Or my parrot that's in the freezer or something. You think of mourning having to do with grief or something like that. Sadness. But in the relationship here where Jesus is saying, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, the mourning he's talking about is the mourning that comes from true, heartfelt grief of our own spirit in realizing that we have missed the mark, that we have not lived up to God's expectations, that we're not worthy, sort of salvation, other than by God's grace that he extends to us. And it's when we realize at that moment that God is there for us and that God has been pursuing us and that we have been denying him, that we have access to that relationship with him. So as opposed to somebody that, has anybody seen that movie, Nancy, what's the movie we were talking about last night, the new one that's out right now? About the guy that does all the oil? There Will Be Blood. Anybody seen that? One person. Okay, there's a scene in this movie, so you'll all relate to this really well. There's a scene in the movie where a person goes before a preacher and admits his sinful ways, and he's doing it strictly as a matter of convenience. And it's a cold-hearted, not sincere admission of past sins. And what Jesus is talking about here is the exact opposite. He's talking about that time in our life where we groan with that feeling of having missed it, and then having realized that we've missed it, and then being open to that and allowing Christ to come in and for that kingdom to be living through us. So we have this sense at the beginning of the Beatitudes in these first two of being what it means to be poor in spirit, of what it means to mourn, not in terms of sadness, but in terms of grieving for our own failures, in terms of living life, which can then go away, and we can be comforted because we know we're not going to be held accountable for that, because we can't achieve a perfect life on our own. I hope that makes sense. And in many ways, some of these things don't make a whole lot of sense just in words. And our founder, John Wesley, never wrote a systematic theology. He never wrote down a big book about what he thinks about God, and he was too busy just out doing his ministry. His brother Charles Wesley, look in front of you on the chairs in front of you. There should be a hymnal there somewhere. Everybody grab a hymnal real quick. And I'm just blessed that Brent was open to changing the closing song today. Everybody got a hymnal? Charles Wesley wrote a lot of the hymns in that hymnal. And poor Ken, he's in the front row. He can't find one. Somebody give Ken a hymnal. There we go. Brent was open to making a change in our closing hymn today, because John Wesley never wrote a systematic theology. His brother Charles wrote hundreds of hymns. And so it is said that Charles Wesley actually wrote John Wesley's theology in the hymns. If you open up to number 157, Brent, come on up, if you would.
57.
What did I say? Number 57. It's the very first hymn, not the first page, but the very first hymn.